All right, seniors, let's go through Chapter 14, Section 3, our last section that we're going to do in Chapter 14 before we move on to banking and monetary policy. The GDP, unemployment, and now inflation that we've been studying, they're going to be key as we move into studying monetary and fiscal policy. So if you have any questions as I go through these, please make sure that you shoot me an email, as this information is going to become very, very important. All right, so we know inflation is when the value of the dollar goes down, and that in turn makes prices go up. So it's kind of when I was your age, it only cost, when you hear your grandparents or your parents say that, that's what we've got for inflation. Inflation can be measured by usually two things. Those are the most important measurements: the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index. You might remember that we previously looked at this index. The Consumer Price Index looks at a market basket of goods that the average person buys, and it prices those goods every month. And it's looking for monthly, did those goods become more expensive or did they become less expensive? The second measurement for inflation is the implicit GDP price deflator, and that also can tell us how much inflation we have in our economy. When we look at inflation, it's measured as an annual rate in terms of a change in the price level. So basically, we go to the CPI and we can look at that price level for January. And then we would compare, for instance, January of 2019, and then we can compare what is it like January of 2020. So we're looking at inflation by comparing it to another year or another month. And that's how we're able to see, have prices gone up? Has there been inflation? So we mathematically can figure it out. We're going to take the change in the price level, and again, the price level we can get from the CPI or the GDP price deflator, and we're going to divide it by the beginning price level. And then we multiply by 100 because we're trying to get a percent. GDP is measured, like we said, in tenths of percent. Unemployment is measured in tenths of a percent, as is inflation, because these measurements are super important. There can be deflation where the value of our money actually it gets better, so prices go down. We don't usually see that too often. We mainly see inflation. So here you can see inflation and its measurement as a monthly measurement in tenths of a percent. There are 3 degrees of inflation. First one, if you'll remember this from your homework, is creeping inflation. That's where inflation increases anywhere from 1 to 3%. This is usually about annually. This is normal inflation. Creeping inflation is what you guys know just in your lifetime of what it cost to see a movie when you were in grammar school versus what it costs to see a movie now as you're graduating from high school. Galloping in inflation, that's when things start to get a little worse. As your book told you, a number of South American countries see this galloping inflation. We saw it with the collapse of the communist bloc in the Cold War, but prices can go up 100% to 300%. The worst type of inflation is hyperinflation. This is when inflation is completely out of control. We're talking about 500% and above. We don't see this very often. You probably remember this most when you studied World War I and the aftermath with the Weimar Republic, and how the Weimar Republic, as it owed more money to the Allies, all it did was print money, and that created hyperinflation. If you hit this point, you can't recover. You're either going to have to scrap the monetary system and start again like Germany did, or we see today some countries, instead of their currency, they'll start to use another country's currency. I believe this happened in Zaire, I remember right, and they started to use the American dollar. For those of you watching the news, hyperinflation also is something that we see in Venezuela right now. They definitely are in that hyperinflation range. Here's the chart that you might have seen in your world history textbook. This is the Weimar Republic. It tells you in January 1919 that 1 ounce of gold cost 170 German marks. But if you look down at the very bottom at November 30th, 1923, so we're looking at 3 to 4 years later, $87 trillion for an ounce. So you can see this definitely was hyperinflation. People use wheelbarrows to be able to take their money to the store to go shopping. Children were played with bricks of money because it was cheaper to give kids bricks of money than to actually buy toys. Money was also burned as it was cheaper than buying any type of firewood or kindling. You were oftentimes paid multiple times a day because the value of money changed so drastically in just a single 24-hour period that you would get paid in the first part of the day, and you need to go spend that money. You need to go buy groceries for your family, because if you don't, that money will become worthless by the end of the day. And then you can see kind of in the far right corner that money was so worthless that people wallpapered their walls with money. Let's look at the causes of inflation. These aren't all of them, but it gives you a good sampling. The first cause is demand pull theory. Being demand, if you remember this from chapter 4, it's caused by the consumer. Demand is from the consumer's point of view. We have demand pull theory when inflation, when demand becomes so excessive that it creates a shortage for a particular good and the price starts to go up. Another cause of inflation is the Federal Reserve. When they start to deficit spend, they are spending money that they really don't have, and that added theoretical money into our economy pushes the value down. And this kind of goes to our unit 1. If you remember this idea that what gives something value is the fact that it is scarce. So when we have the government deficit spending, we are taking away that scarcity that money should have that gives it value. A third cause of inflation is cost push theory. Whereas demand pull theory is caused by the consumer, cost push theory is caused by businesses. Businesses are experiencing some type of increase in the cost of their inputs. A lot of times it's labor. It could be oil, but most of the time it's labor. And because they have to pay more in the production of their goods, they turn around and raise the price of the cost of the good for the consumer. That increase in the cost of the good is causing inflation. A fourth cause of inflation is this idea of a self-perpetuating spiral of wages and prices. So basically what this is looking at is workers will demand higher wages. And as businesses are forced to pay those higher wages, what they're going to do to make up for having to pay the worker more is to increase the price of the good that they're selling. Now that the price of goods across the market has gone up, workers turn around and say, we need more money to be able to afford to live. And then their wages go up. And then businesses, again, to make up for the cost of the increased wages, raise the prices of their goods. And so that would be our spiral. It just keeps happening. Another cause of inflation is excessive monetary growth. We're going to spend a lot of time looking at monetary policy in the coming weeks. But monetary policy is when the Federal Reserve gets involved in our economy, and they can either increase the amount of money out there or they can decrease. If they begin to increase the amount of money in circulation by having lower interest rates, they're going to cause inflation. It's usually on the demand side of things. As interest rates are low, that makes the consumer willing to take out a loan to buy a durable good, to like a car, a refrigerator, a house. And with that extra money added into our economy, again, we're taking money scarcity away, and that its value goes down, pushing prices up. The results of inflation are super important. You're going to be doing a worksheet today that makes you evaluate whether or not inflation would help a group, hurt a group, or have no effect. When we look at inflation having no effect on somebody, what we're looking at is what's known as a cost of living adjustment, or COLA. It's not a raise. What it is, sometimes employers will answer to unions who say we need a cost of living increase. So maybe, for instance, inflation has gone up 3%. A union will ask for a 3% cost of living adjustment. And what they're asking for is the wages to go up to the rate of inflation. It's not considered a pay increase or a reward. Instead, it allows the worker to continue to buy what they have before. So it would be hinged to inflation. If prices were going up, inflation was going up by 2.5%, the cost of living adjustment would be 2.5%, allowing the worker to be able to consume and buy what they previously had bought before. That's where inflation would have no effect. All right, let's look at those that can be helped and hurt. When we have inflation, the value of the dollar goes down, so you're able to buy less. And that's going to be hardest for those who are on fixed incomes. In our society, mostly we see the elderly, older folks that live on fixed incomes. Fixed income being the idea, maybe it's Social Security or your pension, but each month you're given the exact same amount. If inflation hits and the prices go up, those people on fixed incomes get the same amount as before. And now that money is not going to buy them as much as it did before. So they're going to have to make cuts. So inflation hurts those on fixed incomes because, again, the prices go up, but the amount of money that they have to spend doesn't. And so they'll have to decide not to buy things, and that can create a lot of problems for fixed income folks. Another result of inflation is we change our spending habits. When we see inflation going up and prices going up, that's accompanied by higher interest rates, we tend to not want to buy those durable goods, those big ticket products, like we talked about in previous slides, the car, the refrigerator, the house. As we see inflation go up and interest rates start to adjust to that, people won't buy those expensive goods because it will cost them more in the long run. I mean, imagine if you bought your car for $10,000. Let's start with it. It's a nice even number. And interest rate started off around 5%. That's not bad buying a car because you'll spend at least 5% of the $10,000 to pay back interest. But imagine if that interest rate went up to 15%. You're not going to be as willing to buy that car because the amount that you're going to have to pay in interest will be fairly significant. Another result of inflation is people start to speculate. They get concerned, they get worried, and they start to take money out of their investments and they start to buy goods, a lot of times fancy goods, luxury goods that they're afraid might go up in value. So it changes how people buy. And also our last one that we'll focus a bit on is it's going to alter distribution of income. So let's look at the idea of who's hurt, a lender or a borrower. A lender generally is hurt more than a borrower when we have inflation. Most folks want us to sign a loan at a fixed rate of interest, meaning that if their interest rate is 5% for their 30-year mortgage on their house, it's always 5%. So if we have inflation and the value of the money is going down, their interest rate stays at 5%. So that helps the borrower because now they're paying back that loan at money that's worth less than it originally was. So a borrower is helped because, again, they're paying back the same amount of money as they did before the inflation hit. So now that amount with inflation, it's really less valuable than it was before. The lenders, because of that, there's a type of interest rate instead of a fixed rate of interest. It's called a variable rate of interest. And this works out better for the lender if they have this kind of an interest rate set with there's inflation, because it being variable, if inflation hits, they can take that maybe 5% that they were once at and increase the interest rate to 8% to make up for what inflation is doing to the value of the dollar. So the lender tends to be hurt because they're paid back with money that's less valuable than it initially was. All right, so that's our results of inflation. Please feel free to reach out to me as you work on the worksheet. Inflation is a little bit more of a application understanding thing, so reach out if you have any questions. If not, then I'll check in with you on Monday. Have a good weekend.